The first rule I learned about powerful men was simple. Never look them in the eyes unless you're ready for what happens next. I should have remembered that rule the night Dominic Russo walked into my restaurant. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, turning Manhattan's sidewalks into slick mirrors of neon and headlights. And by the time my shift started, the whole city smelled like wet asphalt and espresso. Friday nights at Bellini's were always chaos. Businessmen celebrating deals, couples pretending their reservations meant something special, tourists whispering about the price of pasta like it might bite them. I'd been on my feet for 6 hours already, balancing trays, smiling at strangers, pretending tips were enough to keep my student loans from swallowing me whole. My name is Emily Carter, 24 years old, waitress by night, graduate student by day, and on that particular night, I was exactly 3 minutes away from clocking out when the front door opened and the entire restaurant went quiet in the kind of subtle way you only notice if you work in places like this long enough. Conversations didn't stop completely. They just softened, like someone had turned down the volume on the room. Even the bartender slowed down mid-pour. I followed everyone's eyes toward the entrance and saw him step inside, tall enough to make the doorway feel smaller, broad shoulders wrapped in a charcoal suit that looked custom-tailored, dark hair brushed back like he didn't have time to care how perfect it already was. Dominic Russo. I didn't know his name yet, but everyone else clearly did. 2 men followed him, both wearing the kind of suits that weren't about fashion but about authority. Not bodyguards exactly, more like gravity. The type of presence that pulled attention whether you wanted it or not. My coworker Jenna leaned close as she passed me with a tray of martinis. "That's Russo," she whispered like the word itself might hear her. "Just serve the table and don't stare." I hadn't planned to stare, but something about him made it impossible not to look twice. Not because he was handsome, though he was in that intimidating, magazine cover kind of way, but because he moved like a man who expected the world to adjust around him. The hostess walked them to the VIP corner near the windows where the rain streaked the glass in silver lines. Table 12. My section. Of course it was my section. I grabbed a wine list and 2 glasses, telling myself it was just another table. Just another group of wealthy men ordering expensive bottles they wouldn't finish. That's all it was supposed to be. I walked across the marble floor, heels clicking softly, rehearsing my usual greeting in my head, the same one I'd said 1,000 times before. But the closer I got, the more aware I became of him watching the room, not casually like most customers, but carefully, like he noticed everything. When I stopped beside the table, he looked up. His eyes were darker than I expected. Calm. Focused. The kind of eyes that made you suddenly aware of every word you were about to say. "Good evening," I managed, holding the wine list steady even though my fingers felt oddly aware of themselves. "Can I start you with something to drink?" He studied me for half a second longer than most customers would. Not rude, not friendly, just observant. Then he nodded once toward the bottle on the menu. "Barolo," he said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. 2 glasses. I turned toward the bar to retrieve the bottle, telling myself to relax, to treat this like every other table I'd served tonight. But as I walked away, I had the strange feeling that the night had just shifted into something I didn't understand yet. And I had the even stranger feeling that Dominic Russo had already noticed. I returned to the bar with the bottle of Barolo balanced carefully in my hands, the deep red glass catching reflections from the warm lights above the counter, and I tried to convince myself that nothing about table 12 was different from the dozens of tables I had served over the past 2 years. But my body did not believe that lie. Something about the way the room had shifted when Dominic Russo entered still lingered in the air, like the pressure changed before a storm. The bartender slid 2 crystal glasses toward me and raised an eyebrow. "That table?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. He let out a slow breath and wiped the counter even though it was already clean. "Just do your job and keep it simple," he said. I forced a small smile and turned back toward the dining room. The rain outside had intensified, streaking the tall windows beside table 12 with long silver lines that blurred the city lights into soft glowing shapes. Dominic Russo sat with the relaxed posture of someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone. One of the men beside him was speaking quietly, explaining something while gesturing toward a phone screen, but Dominic was not really looking at it. His gaze moved across the restaurant slowly, noticing details most people ignored. When I reached the table again, I could feel that attention shift toward me before I even set the bottle down. "Your Barolo," I said, keeping my voice steady as I opened the bottle and poured carefully into the first glass. The scent of dark fruit and oak drifted upward, warm and rich. One of the men thanked me politely, but Dominic did not speak. He simply watched the way I moved, the way I steadied the bottle with my left hand and turned the label toward the table like I had been trained. When I finished pouring the second glass, I lifted the bottle again and stepped back slightly. That was the moment it happened. My heel caught the edge of the polished marble floor where two tiles met unevenly, just enough to throw off my balance. The bottle tilted. A thin ribbon of deep red wine slipped from the lip before I could stop it, landing directly across the sleeve of Dominic Russo's charcoal jacket. Time slowed in that strange way it does when something small suddenly feels enormous. The drop spread across the fabric like ink on paper. The conversation at the table stopped immediately. My heart jumped into my throat. "I am so sorry," I said quickly, setting the bottle down before it could spill further. I reached for the linen napkin tucked into my apron and dabbed carefully at the sleeve, already knowing it was too late to prevent the stain. The man on Dominic's right shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Someone at the next table glanced over. For half a second, no one spoke. Dominic Russo lowered his gaze to the dark mark on his sleeve, then slowly lifted his eyes to mine. I expected irritation, maybe cold dismissal. Instead, there was something else in his expression. Curiosity, the kind that made the silence stretch a little longer than it should have. I stepped back, still holding the napkin, feeling heat climb into my face. And under my breath, quiet enough that I thought no one could possibly hear it over the hum of the restaurant, I muttered a single sentence in Sicilian that my grandmother used to say whenever someone powerful thought they owned the room. The words left my mouth so quietly that I was certain they disappeared into the background noise of the restaurant before anyone could hear them. The soft clink of glasses and distant murmur of conversations swallowing the sentence whole. It was the kind of comment my grandmother used to whisper when someone arrogant walked into a room and expected the world to bow. I had said it without thinking, more habit than intention, and the moment it slipped out I already regretted it. I straightened slowly, still holding the napkin in my hand, ready to apologize again and step away from the table before anyone could notice. But something stopped me. A sound. A low breath that almost resembled amusement. Dominic Russo did not look angry. He did not look insulted. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, like someone who had just heard a joke no one else in the room understood. My stomach tightened immediately. That expression meant only one thing. He had heard me. My pulse began to climb as the silence around the table stretched longer than it should have. The two men sitting with him looked from me to Dominic, confused by his reaction, clearly waiting for him to say something. He did not move right away. He simply lifted the glass of wine I had poured moments earlier and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving my face. I told myself to walk away. That was the professional thing to do. Apologize one more time, offer to bring another napkin, maybe even offer to pay for the cleaning bill out of my tips if it came to that. But my feet refused to move. Dominic set the glass back on the table with calm precision, then leaned back slightly in his chair. The restaurant lights reflected faintly in his dark eyes as he studied me in a way that made the rest of the room seem distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was still quiet, but every word landed clearly between us. Interesting choice of language. My breath caught. For a moment I thought maybe I had misunderstood him. Maybe he was referring to something else. Maybe I had imagined the meaning in his tone. But then he said the next sentence in smooth, unmistakable Sicilian. "Say that again," he said softly, the rhythm of the words carrying the same dialect my grandmother used when she told stories about the small coastal village where she grew up. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. Very few people in New York recognized that dialect. Even fewer could speak it fluently. And the man sitting in front of me clearly understood every syllable I had just muttered under my breath. The two men beside him shifted in their seats, now visibly curious about the exchange they could not follow. Dominic ignored them completely. His focus stayed on me. Then he tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unmistakably amused. But this time, he continued in English, his voice low and deliberate. "Say it again," while looking at me. For a second I forgot how to breathe. The safest choice would have been to deny everything. Pretend I had not said anything at all. Pretend I did not understand Sicilian. Pretend I was just another waitress who made a mistake and wanted to disappear before the night got worse. But Dominic Russo was watching me with the kind of patience that told me he already knew the truth. And something inside me, something stubborn that had survived years of working double shifts and ignoring people who believed money made them untouchable, refused to back down. I slowly set the napkin on the edge of the table and lifted my eyes to meet his. For the first time since he walked into the restaurant, I did not look away. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The restaurant continued around us with the quiet rhythm of a busy Friday night. Glasses clinking, silverware touching plates, rain tapping softly against the tall windows beside the table. But everything near table 12 felt strangely still. Dominic Russo waited with the calm patience of someone who had never rushed for an answer in his life. His two companions exchanged uncertain looks, clearly aware that something unusual was happening even if they did not understand the words behind it. I could feel the weight of the room pressing gently on my shoulders, the silent question of whether I would step back like most people probably did around him. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to, but my voice, when I finally spoke, came out steadier than I expected. I repeated the same sentence in Sicilian, clearly this time, meeting his eyes exactly the way he had asked. The meaning was simple, the kind of phrase my grandmother used when someone powerful forgot that respect worked both directions. When the words left my mouth the second time, the air seemed to hold them there between us for a second before they faded into the noise of the restaurant. One of the men at the table leaned back slightly, clearly realizing the exchange was not an apology. Dominic did not react immediately. Instead, he studied me with an expression that was impossible to read at first, like someone examining a rare object they had not expected to find in an ordinary place. Then the slow smile returned, deeper this time, genuine in a way that softened the sharp lines of his face. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the edge of the table. "Most people," he said quietly, "do not insult me twice in the same minute." The statement was not threatening. If anything, it sounded almost thoughtful, like he was stating an interesting fact rather than delivering a warning. I folded my hands lightly in front of my apron, trying to look like a professional waitress again instead of someone who had just challenged a powerful customer in a language half the world did not speak anymore. "Most people," I replied carefully, "do not spill wine on expensive jackets either, but tonight seems full of surprises." One of the men beside him gave a short, surprised laugh before quickly trying to hide it behind his glass. Dominic glanced briefly in his direction, then looked back at me, the smile still faintly visible. "Where did you learn Sicilian?" he asked. The question came so naturally that it took me a second to answer. "My grandmother," I said. "She moved to the United States before I was born." Dominic nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. His fingers traced the rim of the wine glass absent-mindedly, while his eyes stayed on my face, thoughtful now rather than amused. Around us, the restaurant noise continued to rise and fall like a tide. Waiters moving between tables, the kitchen doors swinging open and closed in the distance. But table 12 had become its own quiet island in the middle of the room. Then Dominic lifted the stained sleeve of his jacket slightly, glancing at the dark mark the wine had left behind. He looked back at me again, and the calm curiosity returned to his voice. "Emily Carter," he said, pronouncing my name carefully as if he had known it long before tonight. "Are you always this honest with strangers? Or am I receiving special treatment?" I blinked once, the sound of my own name landing in the middle of the restaurant like a small stone dropped into still water. For a second I wondered if I had heard him wrong, but Dominic Russo was watching me with the calm certainty of someone who never said things by accident. The way he spoke my name was not curious. It was precise, as if he already knew it long before I stood at his table with a wine bottle in my hand. My fingers tightened slightly against the edge of my apron. "Most customers just read the name tag," I said, keeping my voice light even though I was suddenly aware that my name tag was clipped to the other side of my uniform where he could not easily see it from where he sat. Dominic glanced briefly at my chest, as if considering the possibility. Then his eyes lifted back to mine, and the faint smile returned. "Your name tag is on the opposite side," he said calmly. One of the men at the table looked at me again, clearly realizing the same thing I had just realized. Dominic had not read my name from anything. The quiet realization settled in my stomach like a slow drop in temperature. I had worked in restaurants long enough to know when someone important had already noticed you before you noticed them. You work here 3 nights a week, Dominic continued casually, lifting his wine glass again as if we were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. Usually the late shift. You prefer the tables near the windows because they tip better during the tourist season. The man beside him turned his head slightly, studying me now with open curiosity. I felt heat rise in my face again, though this time it was not embarrassment. It was something closer to confusion. That is a lot of information for someone who just spilled wine on your jacket, I said carefully. Dominic shrugged one shoulder, the motion relaxed. Observation, he replied. It is a useful habit. His tone was so calm that it made it difficult to argue with him, even though the idea that he had noticed me before tonight made my thoughts spin in quiet circles. Around us, the restaurant continued to hum with conversation and movement, the normal rhythm of plates and laughter returning after the brief tension earlier. A waiter passed behind me carrying a tray of pasta dishes, and somewhere in the distance the kitchen bell rang twice. But the air around table 12 still felt focused, like a spotlight that had not quite turned off yet. Dominic set his glass down and glanced once more at the dark stain on his sleeve. Instead of looking annoyed, he almost seemed entertained by it. Emily Carter, he repeated, slower this time, as if testing the sound of the name again. You did not answer my question. I tilted my head slightly. Which one? Whether you are always this honest with strangers. The corner of my mouth lifted before I could stop it. Only when the strangers asked me to repeat an insult while looking directly at them, I said. For the first time since the conversation began, Dominic laughed softly. It was a quiet sound, but it carried enough warmth that the tension at the table shifted slightly. The men beside him relaxed a fraction. Dominic leaned back in his chair again, studying me in silence for another moment before speaking. Then perhaps honesty deserves a reward, he said thoughtfully. Tell me something, Emily. His eyes moved briefly toward the rain-streaked window beside the table, then back to me again. Why would a woman who speaks Sicilian like that choose to spend her evenings serving wine in a Manhattan restaurant? For a moment I considered giving him the safest answer possible. Something polite, something forgettable, something that would end the conversation so I could return to the comfortable rhythm of serving tables and pretending the man in front of me was just another wealthy customer passing through the city. But Dominic Russo had asked the question with the kind of quiet patience that made it clear he was not interested in rehearsed answers. The rain continued sliding down the tall windows behind him, the soft glow of streetlights turning the glass into long ribbons of gold and silver. I folded my hands lightly in front of my apron and met his eyes again. Student loans, I said simply. One of the men beside him chuckled quietly into his wine glass, but Dominic did not smile this time. He watched me carefully, as if weighing the truth of that answer. That is honest, he said after a second. But it is not the whole story. The certainty in his voice made it sound less like a guess and more like a conclusion he had already reached. I exhaled slowly through my nose. It is enough of the story for a Friday night, I replied. Dominic leaned back in his chair again, studying me in that calm, observant way that made it feel like he was reading the small details I did not say out loud. For a moment neither of us spoke. The 2 men at the table returned to their conversation quietly, though I noticed they were still listening with half an ear. Dominic lifted his wine glass again and turned it slightly in the light, watching the deep red color move against the crystal. Your grandmother, he said suddenly, returning to Sicilian for a single sentence, the words smooth and effortless. Was she from Palermo? The question caught me off guard. I had not expected that level of precision. A small town outside of it. I answered automatically, replying in the same language before I could stop myself. Dominic nodded once, as if that detail fit perfectly into a puzzle only he could see. I thought so, he said. The faint smile returned again, though this time it was softer, almost nostalgic. For a brief moment, the powerful presence everyone in the restaurant seemed to recognize faded slightly, replaced by something more human. Then he looked back at the sleeve of his jacket again, the dark wine stain still visible against the charcoal fabric. Tell me something else, Emily Carter, he said. If you dislike powerful men enough to insult them in their own language, why did you not walk away when I asked you to repeat it? The question hung in the air between us, calm but direct. I thought. About that for a second. The truth was simpler than he probably expected. I shrugged slightly. Because you asked, I said. Dominic raised one eyebrow. That is all. I nodded once. You sounded curious, not angry, I said. Curiosity is easier to deal with. For a moment he just looked at me, and then the quiet laugh returned again, deeper this time. It was the first time since he entered the restaurant that his expression lost its careful control. He shook his head slightly, almost amused with himself. You are either very brave, he said slowly, or you have not realized who you are talking to. I tilted my head and glanced briefly around the restaurant before looking back at him again. You are sitting at table 12, I replied. And you still owe me for the Barolo. Dominic Russo did not answer immediately. For a second, he simply looked at me, and the quiet amusement in his eyes returned in a way that made the moment feel less like a confrontation and more like a conversation neither of us had planned to have tonight. The men beside him exchanged another glance, clearly unsure whether they should laugh or pretend they had not heard what I just said. Then Dominic slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed a black credit card on the edge of the table with calm precision. The Barolo, he said lightly, is already paid for. I glanced at the card, then back at him. That was fast, I replied. Dominic lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. Efficiency is a useful habit. One of the men at the table chuckled under his breath and returned to his phone, clearly deciding that the tension from earlier had passed. But Dominic did not look away from me. The rain outside had softened now, the steady tapping against the windows fading into a quiet background rhythm. Inside the restaurant, the evening had settled back into its normal pace. Waiters moving between tables, the low hum of conversations filling the room again. Yet table 12 still felt slightly different, like the center of a quiet circle no one else could see. Dominic picked up his glass again and studied the deep red wine before taking a small sip. When he set the glass down, his gaze lifted to mine once more. Emily Carter, he said, speaking. My name again with the same measured calm. You know something interesting about this city? I tilted my head slightly. There are many interesting things about this city. True, he agreed. But one of them is how many people spend their lives pretending not to notice power when it is sitting right in front of them. The statement was not arrogant. It sounded more like an observation he had repeated many times before. I leaned slightly against the back of the empty chair beside the table, folding my arms lightly. And tonight you think I noticed? I asked. Dominic's eyes held a faint spark of curiosity again. No, he said. Tonight I think you noticed and decided it did not matter. For a moment neither of us spoke again. The quiet confidence in his voice made it clear he was not guessing anymore. I considered that for a second before answering. Power matters, I said calmly. It just does not impress me very much. One of the men beside him lowered his phone slowly, clearly interested again. Dominic did not react the way most powerful men probably would have reacted to a sentence like that. Instead, the same thoughtful smile appeared again. He rested one elbow on the table and leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough that the conversation belonged only to us. That, he said quietly, might be the most unusual thing I have heard all week. I raised an eyebrow. You should hear my grandmother, I replied. Dominic laughed again, the sound low and genuine. Then he straightened in his chair and glanced briefly toward the front of the restaurant, as if remembering something. When he looked back at me, his expression had shifted slightly, not colder, but more focused. Tell me something, Emily, he said. Do you always stay this late after your shift ends? Or is tonight an exception? The question caught me off guard. I checked the clock above the bar without thinking. It was already 10 minutes past the end of my shift. When I looked back at Dominic, the curiosity in his eyes had returned again, but this time there was something else behind it. Not challenge. Not authority. Interest. The kind that suggested the evening was not finished yet. I glanced once more at the clock above the bar, then back at Dominic Russo, realizing that he had noticed the exact moment my shift ended before I had even said a word about it. That small detail made the question feel less casual than it sounded. I adjusted the strap of my apron slightly and gave a small shrug. Normally I leave when my shift ends, I said. But tonight someone asked me to repeat an insult in Sicilian, so the schedule became flexible. One of the men at the table laughed quietly again, shaking his head as he took another sip of wine. Dominic's attention never left my face. The corner of his mouth lifted in that same thoughtful smile that seemed to appear whenever I said something he did not expect. Fair, he said calmly. Unexpected conversations can be valuable. I rested one hand lightly on the back of the empty chair beside the table, aware that I was technically no longer working, but also aware that walking away now would feel strangely unfinished. Around us the restaurant continued moving through the late evening rhythm. Several tables were preparing to leave, chairs sliding softly across the floor, the bartender stacking glasses behind the counter. The rain outside had nearly stopped, leaving the windows covered in thin streaks that reflected the yellow glow of the streetlights. Dominic followed my brief glance toward the door and then back again. "Do you live far from here?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but there was a deliberate patience in the way he waited for the answer. I considered it for a second before responding. "About 15 minutes, I said, if the subway decides to cooperate." Dominic nodded slowly, as if that detail confirmed something else he had already guessed. "And yet you stayed," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "You asked a question," I replied. "It would be rude to leave in the middle of it." That answer earned another quiet laugh from him, softer this time. For a moment, he simply studied the room around us, his gaze moving across the restaurant in that same observant way he had when he first walked in earlier that evening. When his attention returned to me, his expression had shifted again, not serious exactly, but more thoughtful than before. "Emily," he said, leaving off my last name this time. "Have you ever noticed how rarely people speak honestly when they think someone important is listening?" The question sounded almost philosophical. I leaned slightly against the chair again. "People like comfort," I said. "Honesty can be uncomfortable." Dominic nodded slowly. "Exactly." He paused for a moment, turning the wine glass lightly between his fingers before continuing. "Which makes your honesty unusual." I shrugged again, though the attention made me slightly self-conscious. "Or maybe it just means I have less to lose." Dominic's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in interest. The sentence had clearly caught his attention more than the others. For a second, he looked like he might ask another question about it, but instead he leaned back in his chair again and glanced toward the entrance of the restaurant where the last of the rain clouds had cleared away from the street outside. When he looked back at me, that calm curiosity had returned once more. "Then allow me to ask one more honest question," he said quietly. "If you could be anywhere else tonight, somewhere far from this restaurant and this conversation, where would you go?" The question lingered in the quiet space between us, simple on the surface but strangely difficult to answer. I thought about it for a moment longer than I expected before speaking. For a few seconds I did not answer him. The question sounded simple, but the kind of simplicity that forced you to tell the truth if you thought about it for too long. Around us the restaurant was slowly winding down for the night. A couple near the window stood up and gathered their coats, the soft scrape of chairs moving across the floor blending into the low music playing from the speakers above the bar. The storm that had covered Manhattan earlier was gone now, leaving the street outside washed clean and glowing under the row of yellow streetlights. I followed Dominic's earlier glance toward the window and watched a taxi glide through the wet pavement like a reflection moving across glass. Then I looked back at him. "The coast," I said finally. Dominic raised one eyebrow slightly. "The coast," he repeated. "Not very specific." I smiled faintly. "It is specific enough if you know the place." He waited, the same calm patience in his eyes that had been there all evening. I leaned my elbow lightly on the back of the chair beside the table, remembering the way my grandmother used to describe the small village she left. "Decades ago. A little town outside Palermo," I said. "White houses, narrow streets. The kind of place where everyone knows your grandmother's name before they learn yours." Dominic did not interrupt. He simply listened, his fingers resting against the stem of the wine glass without lifting it. "There is a cliff road above the water," I continued. "If you stand there late enough in the evening, the whole Mediterranean turns this deep blue color that almost looks black under the stars." The memory appeared so clearly in my mind that for a second the restaurant around me faded into the background. Dominic studied my expression carefully while I spoke, as if the story told him more than the words themselves. "You have been there," he said quietly. It was not a question. I nodded once. "When I was a kid," I said, "before life became complicated." One of the men at the table leaned back slightly, clearly surprised that the conversation had drifted so far from spilled wine and restaurant service. Dominic, however, looked more thoughtful than before. And if you were there tonight instead of here, he said slowly, what would you be doing? I thought about that for a moment. Probably sitting on the stone wall near the harbor, I said, listening to the fishing boats come in after midnight. Dominic's gaze softened slightly, the quiet smile returning again as if the image amused him in a way he did not explain. That sounds peaceful, he said. I shrugged lightly. It is, I replied, which is why it usually only exists in stories people tell themselves while they are working late shifts in New York. Dominic laughed quietly at that, the sound low but genuine. Then he leaned forward again, resting both forearms on the table as his attention returned fully to me. The restaurant lights reflected faintly in his dark eyes. You know something interesting, Emily, he said calmly. Most people, when I ask that question, tell me about somewhere expensive. A penthouse view, a private island, something impressive. I tilted my head slightly. And I disappointed you? Dominic shook his head once. No, he said softly. You surprised me again. He paused for a moment, studying my face as if deciding something internally before continuing. Then he glanced briefly toward the restaurant entrance where the night outside looked clear and quiet now. When his eyes returned to mine, the calm curiosity was still there, but now it carried something else as well. An idea. Tell me something, he said quietly. If someone offered to take you there again someday, would you say yes? For a moment, I did not answer him. The question lingered in the quiet space between us. Simple on the surface, but heavy with the kind of meaning that made it impossible to respond without thinking first. The restaurant had grown quieter now, the late evening crowd thinning as the staff began clearing empty tables and stacking chairs near the far wall. Outside the tall windows, the city looked calm after the storm, the wet pavement reflecting streetlights in long golden streaks. Dominic Russo watched me with the same calm patience he had shown all night, as if he had already accepted that silence was sometimes the most honest part of a conversation. I crossed my arms lightly against the back of the chair and considered the image again in my mind. The narrow Sicilian street, the stone wall above the harbor, the sound of fishing boats returning after midnight. It felt impossibly far from Manhattan and the smell of espresso and polished marble floors. It depends, I said finally. Dominic tilted his head slightly, waiting for the rest of the answer. On what? I looked at him for a second before responding. On why they are offering, I said. One of the men at the table leaned back with a quiet laugh, clearly entertained by the exchange. Dominic did not laugh. Instead, he studied my face the same way he had earlier, as if the answer mattered more than the question itself. You assumed there would be a reason, he said. There is always a reason, I replied calmly. The corner of his mouth lifted again, that same thoughtful smile returning, as if he enjoyed the logic behind the response. You are careful, he said. I prefer the word practical, I answered. Dominic nodded once, acknowledging the difference. He leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing toward the window where the city lights shimmered across the wet pavement outside. When he looked back at me, the curiosity in his eyes had deepened into something quieter. Very well, he said slowly. Let us say the reason is simple curiosity. I raised an eyebrow. Curiosity about what? Dominic lifted his glass again, but did not drink from it. Instead, he turned it slowly between his fingers, watching the deep red wine catch the light. About the kind of woman, he said calmly, who insults a stranger in Sicilian and then refuses to apologize for it. I exhaled softly through my nose. You asked me to repeat it, I reminded him. True, he admitted. And you did. For a moment, we simply looked at each other again, the conversation settling into a quieter rhythm now that the tension from earlier had faded into something more thoughtful. One of the waiters passed behind me carrying a stack of clean glasses toward the bar. Somewhere near the kitchen, someone laughed at a private joke. Dominic rested his glass on the table again and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that it felt like the conversation belonged only to us. So let me try again, he said. If someone offered you the chance to stand on that cliff road again, watching the Mediterranean under the stars, no obligations, no expectations, just the view you described, would you say yes? The question felt more honest this time, stripped of whatever test he had hidden inside the first version. I thought about it for another second before answering. Then I met his eyes directly, the same way I had when he asked me to repeat the Sicilian sentence earlier. Yes, I said simply. Dominic held my gaze for a moment longer, Then the slow smile returned once more, deeper this time, as if the answer had confirmed something he had been quietly hoping to hear all along. Dominic Russo did not look surprised by my answer. If anything, the quiet satisfaction in his expression suggested that he had expected it all along. He leaned back slowly in his chair, the faint smile still resting at the corner of his mouth, as if the conversation had taken exactly the direction he had predicted from the beginning. Around us the restaurant was nearly empty now. The last group near the entrance stood to leave, their voices fading as the door opened, and the cool night air drifted briefly inside before closing again. The staff had begun dimming the lights slightly, the warm glow of the dining room softening into the calm atmosphere of closing time. I realized then that I was still standing beside table 12, even though my shift had ended almost half an hour ago. Dominic lifted his glass once more and finished the last sip of wine before setting it down with the same deliberate precision he had shown all evening. For a moment he studied the empty glass, as if considering something carefully, before his eyes returned to me. "Then it seems we agree on something," he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" Dominic rested one hand lightly on the table. "That certain places are worth returning to," he replied. I nodded once, though the meaning behind his words still felt slightly unclear. One of the men sitting beside him checked his watch and leaned forward. "Dominic," he said carefully, "we should probably go." Dominic did not look away from me when he answered. "In a moment," he said calmly. The man nodded and leaned back again, clearly used to waiting for his decisions. I watched the brief exchange with quiet curiosity. The dynamic between them made one thing obvious. Dominic Russo was not simply the most confident person at the table. He was the person the others followed without question. Dominic finally stood from his chair, the motion smooth and unhurried. Even that small movement seemed to shift the atmosphere around the table. The two men beside him stood, as well a second later, gathering their coats. Dominic reached for his jacket and glanced briefly at the dark stain left by the wine. Instead of looking annoyed, he almost seemed amused again. He slipped the jacket over his shoulders without another comment about it. Then his attention returned to me. For the first time since he walked into the restaurant earlier that evening, we were standing at the same height. The difference made the moment feel strangely more direct. Dominic studied my face for a second longer, his expression thoughtful rather than intense. "Emily," he said. Hearing my name again sounded different now, less like an observation and more like recognition. I waited. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small card, placing it gently on the table between us. The card was simple, thick white paper with only a name and a phone number printed in clean black letters. No title, no company logo, just his name. Dominic Russo slid the card toward me with one finger. "You said you would go back to that cliff road if someone offered," he said calmly. I glanced down at the card, then back up at him. "I said I would consider it," I corrected. The faint smile returned once more. "That is fair," he admitted. Then he nodded once toward the card resting on the table. "In case you decide curiosity works both directions." For a moment neither of us spoke. The restaurant lights reflected faintly across the polished marble floor, and somewhere behind the bar someone switched off a row of hanging lamps. Dominic stepped back slightly, as if preparing to leave. Then he paused for just a second longer and looked at me one final time. "And Emily," he added quietly, "next time you insult someone in Sicilian, make sure they deserve it." Then he turned toward the door, the two men already following a step behind him as they crossed the nearly empty restaurant floor toward the night outside. I remained standing beside the table long after the door closed behind Dominic Russo. The restaurant felt strangely larger now that he had left, the quiet space he occupied dissolving back into the ordinary sounds of closing time. Chairs scraped softly across the marble floor as the last tables were cleared, and the bartender reached up to switch off another row of warm hanging lights. For a moment, I simply looked down at the card resting on the table. Thick white paper, clean black letters. Dominic Russo. A phone number beneath it. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Just the quiet suggestion that the conversation from earlier might not be finished. I picked it up slowly, turning it once between my fingers as if it might reveal something more if I looked at it from another angle. It did not. The card was exactly what it appeared to be. Jenna appeared beside me a second later, carrying a stack of folded linen napkins. She followed my gaze down to the card, and then looked toward the door Dominic had walked through moments earlier. "Was that really him?" she asked in a low voice. I slipped the card into the pocket of my apron before answering. "Apparently," I said. Jenna let out a quiet breath. "You know, people in this city talk about him like he runs half of downtown." I shrugged lightly. "People talk about a lot of things." She studied my face for another second, clearly curious, but the kitchen bell rang again, and she turned away to finish stacking the last of the silverware trays. I walked toward the window near table 12 and looked outside. The rain had stopped completely now. The street shimmered under the streetlights, taxis passing slowly through the late evening traffic, while the sidewalks filled with people heading home after long days in the city. Somewhere in the distance, a subway rumbled beneath the pavement. Everything looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening before Dominic Russo walked through the door. Yet the night felt different somehow. I untied the apron from around my waist and folded it over my arm before heading toward the employee lockers near the back hallway. As I passed the bar, the bartender gave me a small nod. "Your friend left a generous tip," he said casually. I paused for a second. "Friend might be an exaggeration," I replied. He smiled slightly. "Maybe, but he looked like someone who does not forget people easily." I did not answer that. Instead, I finished changing out of my work shoes and grabbed my coat before stepping out the back in trance into the cool night air. The city smelled clean after the storm, the faint scent of rain rising from the pavement as I started walking toward the subway entrance on the corner. My hand slipped into my coat pocket without thinking, brushing lightly against the small card resting there. I slowed my steps slightly as I reached the edge of the sidewalk. The streetlight above the subway stairs flickered once before steadying again. For a moment, I imagined the narrow cliff road above the Mediterranean that I had described earlier, the dark blue water stretching beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. The image felt distant and impossible again, like a story someone tells themselves while waiting for the next train to arrive. I pulled the card from my pocket and looked at the number printed beneath Dominic Russo's name. The city moved around me with its usual restless rhythm, taxis passing, people talking, the distant sound of music drifting from somewhere down the block. Then I slipped the card back into my pocket and descended the subway stairs, still unsure whether curiosity was something I should trust. The subway platform was quieter than usual that night. A thin layer of moisture still clung to the concrete. Walls from the earlier storm, and the faint scent of rain mixed with the warm metallic smell that always lived underground in New York. I stood near the yellow safety line, my hands tucked into the pockets of my coat, while the distant rumble of an approaching train echoed through the tunnel. Around me, a handful of late commuters waited in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, their reflections stretching across the wet tiles beneath the dim overhead lights. I pulled the small card from my pocket again without fully realizing I was doing it. Dominic Russo. The name looked exactly the same as it had outside the restaurant, simple and confident on the white surface. It was strange how something so small could carry the weight of a decision. I turned the card once between my fingers and remembered the calm way he had watched me all evening, the quiet patience in his voice, the way he seemed more interested in answers than in control. Most people in Manhattan moved fast, spoke fast, expected fast results. Dominic Russo had done none of those things. The train roared into the station a moment later, the rush of wind pushing lightly against my coat as the doors opened with a metallic chime. I stepped inside with the others and found a seat near the window, watching the platform slide away as the train began moving through the dark tunnel. The city above us continued its restless rhythm, while the subway carried its quiet cargo beneath the streets. For several stops, I simply sat there, listening to the steady hum of the train wheels against the tracks. The card remained in my hand, the number beneath his name still clear in the faint reflection of the overhead lights. I thought about the cliff road above the Mediterranean again, the way the ocean looked under the stars, the sound of fishing boats returning to the harbor long after midnight. It had always felt like a memory that belonged to another version of my life, something too distant to ever return to. But the idea he had placed on the table earlier had changed something small inside that memory. Not a promise, just a possibility. The train slowed as it approached my stop. The doors opened, and I stepped back onto the platform, climbing the familiar staircase toward the street above. The air outside was cool and clean after the rain, the sidewalks reflecting the glow of storefront lights that had not yet closed for the night. I paused at the corner before heading toward my apartment building, pulling the card from my pocket one more time. For a long second, I looked at the number again. Then I slipped the card back into my coat and continued walking. The city around me moved the same way it always did. Taxis passing, people laughing somewhere down the block, the quiet rhythm of Manhattan continuing without pause. But as I reached the entrance to my building, one thought stayed with me in a way I could not ignore. Some nights change nothing at all, and some nights quietly open a door you did not even know existed. The only question left was whether curiosity was brave enough to walk through it.